The human heart acts as a pump, pumping blood throughout the body and nourishing the body's tissues with oxygen and other nutrients. The heart is in the thoracic cavity between the lungs. The lower tip of the heart, or the apex, is situated slightly to the left of the sternum, between the fourth and fifth ribs. Heart has 4 chambers: the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. There are 4 valves that separate the chambers and the blood vessels of the heart. They are the tricuspid or right atrioventricular valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve, the mitral or left atrioventricular valve, and the aortic semilunar valve. The intraventricular septum separates the 2 ventricles of the heart. The large blue veins going into the heart are the superior and the inferior vena cavas. The curved artery at the top of the heart is the aorta or aortic arch, which feeds into the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery, and then descends behind the heart to make the descending aorta. The pulmonary arteries go to the lungs, and the pulmonary veins come from the lungs back to the heart. The heart actually has 2 pumps. The pulmonary circuit pumps blood to the lungs for oxygenation, while the systemic circuit pumps the newly oxygenated blood to the body. Oxygen-poor blood from the body goes through the superior and inferior vena cavas and into the right atrium. Then, the blood gets pumped through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The blood is then pumped through the pulmonary semilunar valve and into the pulmonary arteries. The oxygen-poor blood travels through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs and comes back oxygenated via the pulmonary veins and into the left atrium. The blood in the left atrium is pumped into the left ventricle through the mitral valve and then into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. The blood finally gets distributed to the body and comes back to the heart through the vena cavas, starting the cycle all over again. Also, notice that the left ventricle muscle is much thicker than that of the right ventricle. This is because the right ventricle pumps blood to only the lungs, while the left ventricle needs to pump blood throughout the body. There are 2 types of cardiac muscle cells. Myocardial contractile cells make up 99% of the cells in the atria and the ventricles, and contract to pump blood throughout the heart. Myocardial conducting cells are specialized muscle cells tasked with the initiation and propagation of the electrical impulse through the heart. Cardiac muscle cells have intercalated discs, in which different muscle fibers attach. These discs contain tight junctions and desmosomes that help hold the muscle together during contractions, and gap junctions that allow the passage of ions and thus help propagate the impulse. Heart conduction starts with the sinoatrial or SA node at the top back of the right atrium. This node is usually called the pacemaker of the heart, as it creates normal sinus rhythm. The impulse goes from the SA node through the internodal pathway to the atrioventricular or AV node. The impulse also travels from the SA node through the Bachmann's bundle to the left atrium. This impulse causes the muscles of the 2 atria to contract, pumping blood into the ventricles. The AV node, which is in the lower right atrium, delays the impulse for a bit before sending the impulse through the bundle of His. The impulse then travels from the bundle of His through the bundle branches and finally to the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers initiate the contraction of the muscles in the ventricles, pumping blood from the ventricles to either the aorta or the pulmonary artery. Doctors use an electrocardiogram or an EKG to visualize and diagnose this conduction pathway. The EKG consists of the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. The P wave shows the depolarization of the atria. The QRS complex shows the depolarization of the ventricles. The repolarization of the atria also occurs during the QRS complex, but is masked by the ventricular depolarization. And finally, the T wave shows a repolarization of the ventricles. There are also different segments and intervals that are measured by doctors. These include the PR interval, the QT interval, the PR segment, and the ST segment. These intervals and segments can show doctors the time between ventricular and atrial depolarizations and repolarizations, which help in diagnosing certain diseases. An electrocardiogram can also be used to diagnose abnormal heart rhythms, such as a second-degree heart block where some P waves aren't followed by a QRS complex, atrial fibrillation where the atria flutter or beat without coordination, ventricular tachycardia where the heartbeat is irregularly fast, or ventricular fibrillation where the ventricular contractions are disordered. There are also many other abnormal heart rhythms that can be viewed with an EKG.